He was 15 years old. He was King of England. And for days, the most educated doctors in the country stood over his bed, cutting him, bleeding him, starving him, and calling it treatment. Every time the child cried out, they said the same thing. The pain means it is working. This is not a story about medieval ignorance. This is a documented medical case. A child king did not die from disease. He died from the cure. July 1553. Greenwich Palace, England. The room was heavy with incense, heat, and the smell of sickness. Courtiers moved quietly. Voices were hushed. No one wanted to be the one heard laughing or speaking too loudly while the king was dying. On the bed lay Edward VI of England. He was 15 years old. Edward was not a weak child. He had been raised to rule. Tutors drilled him daily in scripture, law, history, and languages. He debated theology with bishops. He wrote policy notes in his own hand. He carried himself like a miniature adult, trained from birth to suppress fear, pain, and doubt. But now, none of that mattered. His body was shrinking. His face had collapsed inward. His legs were so thin that servants struggled to lift him without causing pain. His skin was tight and dry, his eyes sunken and fever bright. For weeks, royal physicians had worked tirelessly at his bedside. They had bled him, they had purged him, they had starved him, they had heated him, they had medicated him with substances we now classify as poisons. And every time Edward cried out, every time he begged for relief, every time his body weakened further, the doctors said the same thing. The medicine is working. Edward VI did not die because he was a sick child. He died because the adults around him believed suffering meant success. This is the story of how England's boy king was medically destroyed. Slowly, deliberately, and with absolute professional confidence. This is the story of how England's boy king was medically destroyed. Slowly, deliberately, and with absolute professional confidence. Edward Tudor was born on October 12, 1537, the long-awaited son of King Henry VIII. His birth came at a terrible cost. His mother, Jane Seymour, died less than 2 weeks later from complications of childbirth. From his first days of life, Edward was surrounded by death, expectation, and fear. Henry VIII doted on his son, but Edward's upbringing was rigid and unforgiving. He was raised not as a child, but as a future ruler. His schedule was brutal. Hours of study every day. Cold rooms, early mornings, physical discipline, emotional restraint. By the time Edward was 10, he was already king. Henry VIII died in January 1547. Edward VI ascended the throne at the age of 9. England was now ruled by a child, surrounded by regents, nobles, bishops, and physicians, who all claimed to know what was best for him. Edward was often sick. He suffered from recurring respiratory infections, fevers, and bouts of weakness. In modern terms, he was likely frail, possibly immunocompromised, but none of this was considered abnormal in the 16th century. Illness was expected. Treatment was not gentle. Tudor medicine was not designed to comfort the sick. It was designed to fight disease aggressively, visibly, and violently. The guiding theory was humoral medicine, the belief that the body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on balance. Illness meant excess. The solution was simple. Remove something. If the patient was weak, remove blood. If the patient had a fever, remove fluids. If the patient cried out, increase treatment. Edward's physicians were among the most respected men in England. They were educated, they were confident, they were certain they understood the human body. They were also completely wrong. In early 1553, Edward began to decline rapidly. He developed a persistent cough. He ran a low fever that would not break. He complained of chest pain and exhaustion. He lost weight at an alarming rate. Modern historians believe Edward was suffering from tuberculosis or a severe pulmonary infection, possibly complicated by malnutrition and immune weakness. In other words, he needed rest, warmth, nutrition, hydration. Instead, his doctors began treatment. The first intervention was bloodletting. Edward was strapped gently but firmly to the bed. A vein in his arm was opened with a lancet. His blood flowed into a bowl while physicians observed its color and thickness. Dark blood was bad blood. Thin blood was weak blood. Either way, the answer was the same. More blood must be taken. Edward fainted during one session. He woke confused and terrified. His sheets were stained red. His arm throbbed. The doctors nodded approvingly. The body is responding. When bloodletting failed to produce improvement, the physicians escalated. Edward was given emetic substances designed to induce vomiting. He retched violently. His small body convulsed as his stomach emptied again and again. Servants had to hold him upright as he vomited bile and blood into basins. When vomiting was not enough, purging followed. Edward was administered laxatives, enemas, and mercury-based compounds meant to cleanse the bowels. He suffered explosive diarrhea for hours at a time. His bedding had to be changed constantly. His skin became raw and inflamed. He cried out in embarrassment and pain. The doctors reassured the regents. This is necessary. The corruption must leave the body. Edward began to beg for water. They denied it. Fluids, they believed, fed the disease. Edward's fever worsened. 2 Tudor physicians. Fever was excess heat. The solution was paradoxical. Force the body to sweat. Edward was wrapped in heavy blankets, his chambers were heated, his windows were sealed, fires were kept burning even as his skin burned to the touch. He gasped for air, sweat soaked through his clothing and bedding, his lips cracked, his tongue swelled. He pleaded for relief. The doctors smiled. The poison is leaving through the skin. Food was restricted, meat was forbidden, broths were watered down. Edward's already frail body began to consume itself. His muscles wasted away, his face hollowed, his ribs became visible. Still, the doctors persisted. Edward was old enough to understand what was happening. This was not a baby unaware of pain. This was a thinking, articulate child who knew the adults around him were choosing this. He asked questions. Why does it hurt so much? Why am I getting weaker? When will it stop? The answers were always the same. Soon, this means it is working. Be brave. You are a king. Edward began to cry during treatments. Witnesses recorded that he begged for them to stop bleeding him. He asked for rest. The physicians refused. To stop would mean admitting failure. By June 1553, Edward was dying. His kidneys began to fail from dehydration and toxic medications. His urine output decreased. What little he passed was dark and foul-smelling. His lungs filled with fluid. Every breath was a struggle. His cough produced thick sputum streaked with blood. He developed edema. His feet and legs swelled grotesquely. His skin stretched tight. The doctors misread every sign. The swelling meant blocked humors. The weakness meant the disease was retreating inward. The confusion meant toxins were leaving the brain. They increased treatment. More bleeding, more purging, more heat, Edward screamed. In the last week of his life, Edward could no longer stand. He drifted in and out of consciousness. When awake, he was delirious. He spoke of shadows in the room. He cried for his mother, whom he barely remembered. The doctors continued to work. Blistering agents were applied to his skin to draw out illness. Chemical burns formed. Fluid-filled blisters wept and broke. His body shook with chills, even as he burned with fever. On July 6, 1553, Edward VI died. He was 15 years old. He weighed barely more than a child. The physicians did not apologize. They praised themselves. Records show they believed they had done everything possible, that the illness was too severe, that the king's body had failed. They recommended similar treatments for future patients. Edward was buried in Westminster Abbey. England mourned its boy king. Few questioned how he had been treated. With modern knowledge, Edward's death is tragic and infuriating. He likely suffered from a chronic infection exacerbated by malnutrition and stress. With rest, warmth, nutrition, and hydration, he may have survived. Instead, he was bled into anemia, dehydrated into kidney failure, poisoned with mercury, starved during critical illness, heated into collapse. Edward did not die of disease. He died of treatment. Edward VI's death forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The doctors were not cruel men. They were confident men. They were educated men. They were wrong. They believed suffering meant success. They believed authority meant truth, and the child paid the price. Edward did not have the power to refuse. He did not have the strength to resist. He was a king in name only. And in the end, England's boy king died screaming, while the adults around him called it healing.